distinguished speakers, good afternoon to you. On behalf of the Global Network for Rights and Development and our President, Dr. Tools-e.g, the Director of GNRD Brussels, Mr. Ramadan Abu Jazar, it is a pleasure for me to welcome all of you to this event on the elimination of all forms of forced labor or compulsory labor. I very much appreciate the opportunity to moderate this event with such distinguished speakers and at such an appropriate moment. It is indeed very fitting that we should hold this event here in the capital of the European Union, which has been from the very beginning such a driving force behind combating all kinds of forced labor throughout the EU. The Global Network for Rights and Development is an international NGO established in June 2008 with the aim to enhance and support both human rights and development by adopting new strategies and policies for real change. One of the main objectives of our NGO is to promote and protect workers' rights and to improve working conditions globally through adherence to international standards. We need to make global migration and the global market safe for those who are dreaming of a new life. Indeed, this is why forced labor is so destructive to human dignity. It takes ordinary people's dreams for a better life and turns them into nightmares. We must also challenge the lack of visibility of trafficking in persons for forced labor. Too often, forced labor is hidden from the public view, or the victim is so ashamed or psychologically damaged he or she is unable to discuss the experience. Such lack of visibility exists around the world. Victims are often invisible, voiceless, and forced to live in society's margins. Forced labor and trafficking for forced labor is a global challenge, demanding a global response, strong partnerships, and the commitment and engagements of all kinds of sectors. Only through international cooperation can we stop criminals making grotesque profits from the exploitation of human beings. Forced labor can be defined as any work or service performed against a person's will under the threat of punishment. It is found increasingly in the private economy and labor-intensive or under regulated sectors such as construction, agriculture, fisheries, as well as in mining and in prostitution, of course in domestic work. According to the International Labour Organization, more than 20 million people are in forced labor today, and almost all countries are affected. This event will highlight the plight of migrant construction workers in Qatar who face a host of systemic policies and practices that prevent their basic labor rights. These workers pay exorbitant recruitment fees in their home countries and take on debts that leave them desperate to keep their jobs in Qatar, regardless of the working conditions. Recruiting agents often provide inadequate information or deceive workers about the kind of jobs that they will perform or the salaries that they will earn. According to Human Rights Watch, many workers see no written agreement until they arrive in Qatar, while some never see one at all. Between workers' recruitment steps and contracting requirements that fail to guard against deception, workers risk being subjected to forced labor or conditions of human trafficking. Now, Qatari law does little to address the abuse that prevails throughout workers' recruitment processes. There are also significant gaps in national legislation restrict the ability of migrant workers to organize or to terminate their employment contracts and to change the employer. In general terms, low-skilled migrant workers are the most vulnerable to human trafficking and forced labor. Their precise motivation for migrating may be different, yet they all share a desire to better provide for themselves and their families at home. And they do that by securing work and incomes that simply do not exist in their countries of origin. Victims of trafficking usually have limited financial resources. At the same time, many are resilient women and men who decide to go abroad for work, and they know the exploitations problems, but with the lack of job opportunities at home, they have to go there. Finally, with millions of people suffering from this global crime, we must act urgently. The victims demand it. We must review the data, develop the processes, and encourage national laws to prosecute those who exploit human beings. Ladies and gentlemen, what we say here today, we must be prepared to do tomorrow. I thank you very much. Next, I would like to welcome and introduce to you our keynote speaker, Mr. Paul Murphy. Mr. Murphy is a member of the European Parliament representing Dublin, Ireland. He's a member of the Socialist Party, which is affiliated to the Committee for Workers International, an organization that's active in over 40 countries. As an MEP, Mr. Murphy highlighted a range of workers' rights abuses, including forced labor in the cotton harvest in Uzbekistan, the health and safety conditions of clothing workers in Bangladesh, and the repression against the independent trade union movement in Kazakhstan and South Africa. Mr. Murphy, thank you for joining us here today. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thanks a lot to the Global Network for Rights and Development for the invitation to speak today, to give some opinions on what I think should be a major issue on the top of Parliament's agendas, on the top of trade union activists' agendas, on the top of human rights activist agendas, but also to hear and learn from others who are active on these issues. My apologies for being late, first of all. And also my apologies, I won't be able to stay quite until the end. Kevin from my office is here and will be able to talk to people about things that we can try and do in the Parliament to try and assist you who are trying to raise these issues. To start with, I think it's clear what you have in Qatar is a really, really scandalous situation. What makes the modern day slavery worse in a sense is the fact that it exists side by side with massive, obscene, glittering wealth. Qatar is the richest country in the world on a GDP per capita basis. GDP per capita of $106,000, when the average migrant worker is paid somewhere in the region of $2,000 to $2,500. And so you have huge, gross exploitation of workers in reality in the form of bonded labour, in the form of modern day slavery, happening alongside this massive wealth that coexists with it. And that form and the scale of the exploitation that takes place is obviously contrary to everything that activists, trade unionists, socialists, progressive people right across the world have fought for and is seen as being acceptable or unacceptable behaviour. It was the General Secretary of ITUC, the International Trade Union Confederation, that I think correctly described Qatar as a slave state. When you have such a vast bulk of the economy, 90% or 90% plus of the workers being immigrant workers in these sort of circumstances, that's really the only description you can put on such an economy that is so dependent upon this form of bonded labour that is actively encouraged and supported by the government. This isn't something that's happening underground. And so the conditions that face these workers, it's in every aspect of their lives. And in reality, these people are slaves. They have a slave-like existence because they have no freedom of movement. They can't, the employers hold the exit visas, and so they're unable to just simply say, okay, I've had enough, I'll return home. And in many cases, the employers also hold the passports. So that's the situation as it is now. they're preparing for the World Cup, the start of the construction process for the World Cup. They're going to be bringing in, apparently it's 4 jumbo jets chartered a day from Nepal, bringing in migrant workers who are going to be added to this system of exploitation. And so you see how the situation is going to get worse and worse. And the number of accidents, the number of deaths that we're talking about is something like, a Guardian research said it was about 1 per day of migrant workers on the construction sites, which means that more people will die in the building of the football stadiums for the World Cup in 2022 than players will play on these football pitches that all these, the bones of workers have gone into. So it's a scandalous situation, and it's a pre-existing scandalous situation for Qatar, but it's also a scandalous situation now for FIFA. FIFA has to bear a responsibility for this, and FIFA has attempted to say, well, yeah, we've raised the issues, but it's not really for FIFA. FIFA isn't a workers' rights, an anti-slavery, a human rights organisation. FIFA simply organises football tournaments. So we'll raise these points, but you can't really expect us to monitor it or for anything to happen. And I think it's for people around the world, for football fans, for activists, for others, to say that that's entirely unacceptable. That FIFA does have a responsibility to the workers who are building the stadiums that they are going to host their football tournament in. Of course, this isn't, new for FIFA. The World Cup in the Russian World Cup. Recent news has come out that in Russia they're introducing new laws which will apply to those workers working in the building of the football stadiums, etc., the infrastructure for the World Cup, whereby some labour laws will be excluded from applying to those workers. And so FIFA benefits from this situation. That's the ultimate scandal. There was a quote from Nick Cohen, who I perhaps wouldn't normally quote, but accurately just said that the world's finest footballers will be running over the bones of the faceless men who died that they might play. That's the situation, and it's a crime by FIFA, and the leadership of FIFA in particular needs to be highlighted. Just one other area of industry that I would highlight, because it's scandalous. I mean, it's in all aspects of the economy, because the economy is so dependent upon this form of migrant labour, modern day slavery, construction being the most obvious one and the one that is most relevant to the World Cup. But the other one that is very relevant is the airlines, which will be, they're now bringing in massive numbers, thousands, tens of thousands of migrant workers to work in these conditions, but also will be bringing in people to watch the World Cup. And there, the same conditions apply. In Qatar Airlines, 100% migrant workers, all women, all barred for the first 5 years that they work there from marrying anyone. After that, they have to apply for permission in order to marry someone. If they get pregnant, they can be fired just like that. Again, no exit visas, so no right to decide to leave, to return home, or to do anything like that. Incredible gross exploitation. And Qatar Airways is now in the One World Alliance, which is one of these global airline alliances, including British Airways. And so you see the connection that exists and the ability for us in the West to put pressure on the kind of corporations that are connected to these. And there's a quote from the CEO of Qatar Airlines that I think says really a lot, where he says, he's speaking to the West, says, if you did not have unions, you wouldn't have this jobless problem in the Western world. It is caused by unions making companies and institutions uncompetitive and bringing them to a position of not being efficient. If you go and ask the politicians in most of the countries in the Western world, they would love to have the system we have, where the workers have rights through the law, but they do not have rights through striking and undermining successful institutions that provide jobs to their needs. And I think he speaks a certain truth there, in the sense that if people could get away with it, well then yes, they would pay people as low as possible. They would make sure that people can't get pregnant, they get maternity leave. They would make sure people aren't married, etc., etc. But the point is that those rights have been won in certain countries, and there's a battle around those rights. There's an attempt to take those rights away from people, or begin to take some of those rights away from people. But those rights have been won through struggle and then established as norms that are accepted by people. And that's what they don't want to happen in Qatar, and that's what we need to try and encourage and assist to happen. So just finally, in terms of what can we do? I think a lot of it is, I think FIFA should pull out the World Cup from Qatar on the basis of what's happening, on the basis that it's 2 years now since it was announced, no changes have taken place. That's what I think we can raise that demand. We should in any case use the fact that the World Cup is going ahead, there's going to be discussions around this to really highlight what's going on, to try to shame the Qatari government into properly ratifying and then implementing the relevant ILO conventions. Use it to pressurise the Western corporations which are involved in the construction industry in Qatar. There's a number of construction companies that are either consulting or directly involved in Qatar where these sort of conditions exist. They should be pressured. We should use publicity around it, educate people about it, to encourage people to be active around it, encourage the trade union movements across Europe, across the world, to take this up as a key international solidarity campaign. Again, hitting, for example, the multinationals that are based in the countries where they have a basis of activity. In the Parliament, what we will be arguing and pushing is to try and take this as a human rights urgency in the Parliament. Again, unfortunately, it says something about the European Union that anything that passes in human rights urgency, which they do on Thursday after everyone else has gone home, doesn't really have any effect in the sense that the Parliament, it doesn't have any legislative effect, but it's a political statement. It's useful to get it done in terms of raising awareness about the issue that can then be used to campaign. And I think one of the things that we can be doing, we're trying to shame the Qatari government, shame the corporations, in that way pressurise them to do what is necessary. But I think also in doing that, we're creating the environment where it's more likely that people will feel confident in very, very difficult circumstances to speak out about their experiences, to try to organise to resist the extreme exploitation. I use this quote a lot because I think it's very, very good. Frederick Douglass, the abolitionist, the anti-slavery campaigner, who said that power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has and it never will. And that is unfortunately the reality all across the world. In Qatar, it's a particularly bad situation, but that demand in terms of an abolition of slavery, of decent rights and conditions for working people, for all ordinary people in Qatar, needs to be raised. We need to do whatever we can in terms of international solidarity action, raising awareness to create an environment whereby we can make real changes, apply real pressure over the next number of months and number of years.
GNRD have sent letters for most MEPs explaining the need of an urgency resolution in the situations in Qatar. And now our next speaker, and Mr. Kumar Raj Karel. He's the Deputy Chief of Mission and the Counselor of the Embassy of Nepal. He will be representing the position of the Nepalese official when it comes to the recent reports highlighting the migrant workers, the Nepalese migrant workers' problems. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Mr. Abdulakar, moderator and program director of GNRD. Honorable MEP, Mr. Paul Murphy, for your insightful opinion. Dr. Alex Ba, expert in contemporary anti-slavery and forced labor and human rights issues. And Mrs. Erin Wintermeyer, representing ILO. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for this opportunity. I would like to thank the organizers for inviting the Embassy of Nepal to express its opinion on this very important topic of elimination of all forms of forced or compulsory labor. This is very important for us, as has been highlighted by Mr. Paul Murphy just now, and where, especially in the context of recent news coming in media about Nepalese workers' death, especially following the news published in the Guardian newspaper from UK. I would like to present the opinion of the embassy of the government of Nepal in a very comprehensive and balanced way. First of all, let me start just talking about our current situation, political situation, is an emerging democracy coming out from a decade-long conflict and currently transitioning through the peace-building and constitution writing process. Nepal takes violation and suppression of human rights, including the practice and prevalence of forced and compulsory labour, very seriously, and is fighting against it with its full force. In its fight against forced labour, Nepal is actively working in close engagements and collaborations with ILO, and as a member of ILO, Nepal adheres to ILO's fundamental principles. As part of its engagement, Nepal has so far ratified 7 out of 8 core ILO conventions without any reservation, including the Forced Labour Convention of 1930 and Abolition of Forced Labour Convention 1957. Among the domestic legislations that are especially targeted at the forced labour are Human Trafficking and Transportation Control Act 2007, Bonded Labour Prohibition Act 2002. So, in terms of our legal commitment, our legal infrastructure, any form of bonded and forced labour are banned in Nepal and punishable by law. In order to protect our migrant workers who are employed abroad, we have also signed bilateral labour agreements with a number of destination countries, including South Korea, Qatar, Bahrain, UAE, Oman, and also we are in the process of signing such agreements with Lebanon, Jordan, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and many other countries. Our diplomatic missions in the destination countries, which are essentially there basically, for the protection of these migrant Nepalese workers. Otherwise, we hardly have other political and other regions for opening of our missions with our scarce resources. So we have our missions in these destination countries, and which have been geared to the best of our financial and administrative capabilities towards addressing this challenge by means of extending enhanced consular services and legal protection, offering shelter and providing relief and rescue services to the Nepalese workers who may be in need of such services due to the abuse at the hands of unscrupulous employment agents and in some instances employers. Our government is actively engaged with our partner countries, the host countries, to better protect the rights of our workers. We have signed a number of bilateral agreements, and we are in the process of improving those agreements and securing further interests of these workers. We have been receiving positive assurances, commitments, and cooperation from these destination countries in ensuring better working conditions for our workers. However, we know this is an ongoing process and cannot be overcome in a short term. A lot remains to be done on the part of both the Nepalese government as well as our partner countries, which are providing the much needed important employment opportunities to our unemployed workforce at home. This is also a sensitive and very complex problem for us, and this issue demands a holistic and balanced approach. On the one hand, in absence of favorable economic conditions at home at this point of time in Nepal, we need to utilize the employment opportunities available for our workforce around the world. While on the other, in doing so, we should strive for the maximum possible protection and benefits for our workers working as migrant workers in these countries. We acknowledge that, despite all these efforts of our government and its partner countries, conditions for forced labour may exist mainly among the workforce employed as domestic workers within the country, and more importantly among the Nepalese migrant workers employed abroad. Few statistics on Nepal's workforce and economy may help to understand the scope and depth of this problem in better light. The labour force strength of Nepal is 18 million, ranking the 33rd in the world. About 75% of this labour force is engaged in agriculture sector, another 7% is employed in industry, and remaining 18% is engaged in service sector. Our structural constraints greatly limit the prospects for economic growth and development and lead to the outflow of migrant workers. Every year, about 400,000 Nepalese youth enter into job market. Majority of them remain unemployed due to unavailability of job opportunities or lack of employable skills at home. As a result, about 1,500 to 1,800 Nepalese youth leave the country every day in search of employment overseas. The number is growing every year, with now more than 2.8 million Nepalese workers are working abroad as migrant workers, which is about 8% of the total population of the country. Despite the attendant heavy social costs, we have to accept the share of remittance to our GDP, which is more than 21% in the last fiscal year. Here, foreign employment has become a compulsion, not a choice of Nepalese people. In addressing this issue, we are facing threefold challenges: regularization of foreign employment sector, producing a skillful workforce and ensuring their rights in the country of employment. It is true that many of our migrant workers are facing various problems due to low level of skills, education, lack of awareness of cultural differences, adverse and contrasting climatic conditions in their destination countries. This results in availability of low quality jobs for them with significant hazards to their safety and well-being. Our mission in Qatar, they are more directly working with this, and as one of the host countries which has received more than 300,000 Nepalese workers since last 10 years, we have been actively engaged with that country, and recently we have Embassy of Qatar opened up in Kathmandu, and we are continuing with our dialogue between the two governments to better secure the working conditions and better terms of work for our workers. And we have been receiving assurances and commitments towards that. So we hope and we know that the recent news about the death of Nepalese migrant workers in connection with constructions taking place in Qatar, I think we should think this in a perspective. When we have 300,000 workers in a small country like Qatar, even by natural death we have certain figures which takes place in elsewhere. Besides, these deaths has recently been highlighted in connection with the upcoming World Cup. There the media might have found occasion to bring this fact into focus, but these deaths are there since long, and the factors behind these deaths are many, and related to, as I have already mentioned, to the adverse climatic conditions, because Nepal is very moderate, especially the Nepalese workers going to Qatar come from a moderate temperature, and they just now are working in a very hot Gulf climate of about 50 degrees centigrade.
As much as we urge the Qatari government to work on the living conditions of these migrants, we also urge your government to observe the recruiting agencies to work on better recruiting requirements from Nepal. Thank you very much. And next we will go to our International Labour Organization representative, Ms. Irene Wintermeyer. Ms. Irene Wintermeyer joined the ILO Brussels team as a policy officer in February 2011, where she is working on several topics including forced labor and labor abuses. In this capacity, Ms. Wintermeyer is representing the ILO in these issues in various fora.
Thank you very much for this invitation to this interesting conference. I will speak today about I'll try to highlight the global dimension of forced labor and how the ILO responds to it. But before I start, let me just start by saying a few words about the ILO. So we are a specialized UN agency and we are tripartite. This is our distinguishing feature. Tripartite means we bring together not only governments, but also workers and employers organizations. At the moment we have 185 member states plus the respective workers and employers organizations. And the ILO, so we call them our constituents. And the ILO constituents, they have the mandate to adopt international labor standards, normally at the International Labour Conference. And these standards can normally come in two forms. Either they come in the form of a convention, in which case when the countries have ratified them, they become legally binding, or they come in the form of a recommendation, in which case they are just that, a voluntary recommendation. And the International Labour Office, the administration, supports the ILO constituents to implement the conventions and standards that they have ratified. So we've all heard the recent terrible news about the exploitation of migrant workers in Qatar in the preparation of the World Cup in 2022, and who have to work under apparently such conditions that a lot of them have lost their lives already. And so this particular case has received a lot of attention, but we know that maybe if you pay attention in the media, you can see that now and then these forced labor cases kind of surface also, for instance, in fishing and in the textile industry and other industries that don't receive that much attention. But before I go further, let me define what I mean when I talk about forced labor. Forced labor, what the ILO understands forced labor to be, is defined in the ILO Convention 29. Basically, there are three key elements. One is that it comprises all work or service, which is exacted from any person under the menace of any penalty, and for which the person has not offered him or herself voluntarily. So all work or service, this means there can be activities in the formal economy, but also the informal economy. So it can also be economic, let's say, legitimate economic activities, like in construction, but also forced begging, for instance, would fall under it. So it doesn't have to be legitimately recognized. The menace of any penalty does not just mean physical penalty, it can also mean the loss of privileges and rights. And the third element concerns the element of consent, and this consent, if a worker voluntarily enters in an employment relationship, he has the right to later revoke his consent. So these are the three key elements. In 2012, the ILO published an estimate on forced labor, and it found that almost 21 million people in the world find themselves in a situation of forced labor today. If you look at the map, you can see that in absolute terms, the green map, in Asia and Pacific, we can find most victims of forced labor, followed by Africa and Latin America. And here, if you look at in absolute terms, the Middle East would be at the bottom of this ranking. But if you look at the prevalence of forced labor in relative terms, so how many victims do we have per 1,000 inhabitants, you see that this order kind of changes. So now Central Southeastern Europe and the Commonwealth of Independent States kind of are on the top of this order, followed by Africa, and then you see the Middle East. So it's important to know whether you look at the absolute figures or the relative figures. We also made a distinction between the types of forced labor. So here you can see the brown kind of small slide is the state-imposed forced labor, and the two color slides, the blue one and the pink one, is forced labor in the private economy. So you can see that almost 90% of forced labor takes place in the private economy. And if you look at the colors, the blue stands for non-sexual exploitation, labor exploitation, and the pink one stands for sexual exploitation. So you can see that there's more non-sexual labor exploitation. It's also interesting to look at the gender breakdown. So the pink color stands for female and the blue color stands for male. If you go to the very first column, you can see it's dominated by the pink color, and this gives you the breakdown for sexual exploitation in the private economy. So you can see it's almost entirely the victims are female. If you move to the second pillar, it gives you the labor exploitation so the non-sexual exploitation in the private economy. So you can see it's more men than women that are subject to labor exploitation. And if you go to the very last pillar, that shows you that overall more women are affected than men, slightly more women than men. It's also interesting to look at the element of migration in these figures. So the colors, the blue color means there has been a cross-border movement, the pink color means there has been internal movement, and the brown color means there has been no movement. So if you look at the first pillar, which again shows the one right there, which shows sexual exploitation in the private economy, you can see that this pillar is dominated by the blue color. So it means for sexual exploitation it's strongly associated with cross-border movement. The second pillar shows labor exploitation in the private economy, and there you can see that it's dominated by the brownish color, and so it means that the people are exploited in their place of origin or place of residence. The third pillar is state-imposed forced labor, and there you can see that really the majority is people have not been moved and are exploited there, but are exploited in their place of origin. And overall, what is interesting also is that there's more people that are exploited in their place of origin than have been moved internally or cross-border. And the sectors in which most forced labor victims were reported doesn't come as a surprise. It's domestic work, construction, agriculture and manufacturing, especially textiles. And in domestic work, I can say that in 2011, the ILO constituents adopted the first international standard on domestic workers. It's the Domestic Workers Convention 189, and it entered into force this year on the 5th of September, with Germany being the 10th country ratifying that convention. Also, I wanted to say that there are different ways how a person can end up in a situation of forced labor. So for instance, it can be bonded labor, where for instance a family takes out a loan, or someone in the family takes out a loan, and then his family have to help him repay that loan to the person he owes the money, but in fact the conditions of the loan are such that there's no real way that the person will be able to really repay that loan, and so even sometimes for generations this bonded labor cycle continues. Then there's something what we call trafficking in human beings, and that, what I mean with that is, for instance, if you have a migrant worker and he's offered a job, but then it turns out, but it's a false job offer, so it turns out that the nature of the job or the conditions of the job when he arrives were in fact different than what was probably promised to him. So you have, for instance, sometimes what happens to women is they are promised a job in domestic work or in a factory, but then they find themselves in sexual exploitation and are unable to leave. Or in the case of other workers, they are promised a certain wage, or promised a contract, and then when they arrive, the conditions so that they receive much less pay, they have become indebted in the process of paying the person that recruited them, and it's not the job that they were promised. And then finally, even today, we still have some messages of what probably the average person understands of slavery is really people that are born as slaves and that they still have traditional masters. So when we think about how to address these different, and this list is not exhaustive, but it's, I think, important to understand the patterns of how people can end up in a situation of forced labor when we think about addressing the issue and tackling it. So the ILO response. So basically, I've tried to group it into three areas. There's a standard setting and supervisory mechanism, which I have already alluded to. Then there is technical assistance and capacity building that we give to the countries, and that also the Nepalese representative has just mentioned. And the third area is research. And we also, in Geneva, we have, for forced labor, we have a special action team to combat forced labor that has been set up in 2002, and those were also the ones who produced the figures and developed the methodology on how you can actually estimate forced labor. On the standard setting and supervisory system, I already mentioned one. We have different standards that deal with forced labor. We have the Convention 29, which includes the definition. We have Convention 185. There's also a range of other conventions that aim at protecting vulnerable workers. So you have the worst forms of the Convention against the worst forms of child labor, which explicitly calls, again, prohibits child trafficking and having children in a situation of forced labor and even recruited by armed forces. You have the Domestic Workers Convention, which was a recent, for us it was a historic landmark, and which is now going to be implemented also in the EU at the moment. They're preparing the authorization for member states to ratify. Then you have Migrant Workers Convention and also a Convention of Indigenous People, which particularly prohibits having indigenous peoples bound by any form of forced labor or use their services for that. And because forced labor is often characterized by a simultaneous violation of labor laws, it's important to basically to have a preventative approach. It's important to enforce a range of ILO standards that provide a framework. And I listed two here. One is the Labor Inspection Convention, both in general and in agriculture, which requires states to have a labor inspection system in place. And the second one is, for instance, the one on private recruitment agencies, which specifies that private recruitment agencies cannot charge workers any fees when they recruit them. And what is also interesting at the moment, at the International Labour Conference in June 2014, there will be a discussion on a possible complementary standard to Convention 29, which would seek to address the compensation of victims and prevention and protection. And at the moment, a law and practice report has been prepared, has been sent to all the 185 member states, and the member states have to apply by the end of December 2013, and kind of specify what they would like a new standard to address. And possible forms of the standard could be a protocol or a recommendation, but ultimately it will depend on the ILO constituents to decide on the form. And the way that there's also, with the standard setting comes a supervisory mechanism. Basically it's a reporting, so if ILO member states ratify conventions, they have to report back to the ILO. These reports are examined by a committee of experts. This comprises 20 independent legal jurists. And they also publish an annual report where they highlight their concerns, and there's a discussion of about 30 cases each year at the conference, and the report of this discussion is also published. There's also several complaint mechanisms. There's 3 of them: representation, complaint procedure, and committee of freedom of association. A representation can be made by a trade union or an employer's organization. And actually, in March, the ITUC and the International Woodworkers Union, they have brought a representation against Qatar, allegedly on violation of Convention 29, and the governing body, which is the ILO Management Board, Tripartite, has agreed to examine this case. There's a Committee of Freedom of Association, basically deals with all the complaints received that regard the freedom of association and collective bargaining. And in all three mechanisms, there's a way to set up a dialogue with the government, and there's a way where the ILO, or in this case the committees that examine the case, make recommendations to the government, and then there's a follow-up procedure as well. So that was the standard setting. Then we also have technical assistance programs on forced labor. It has a lot to do with giving advice on the legal framework, helping our constituent member states, for instance, bringing their national laws in line with the Forced Labor Convention, helping to set up action plans against forced labor and also trafficking. We also have worked with a number of countries on regulation of recruitment agencies, and we also work on capacity building to social partners. It also includes trainings for judges, prosecutors, and labor inspectors, because how can a labor inspector know, for instance, if a worker, what kind of indicators does a labor inspector have to watch out for to see whether there's a situation of forced labor. Also judges and prosecutors, they often maybe just see a labor violation, but don't see the whole forced labor or trafficking picture. So it's also making them aware that there is this international standards that their country actually has adhered to. And very recently, an electronic tool was produced on guidelines for victim identification for victims of trafficking. So, for instance, it can be used by labor inspectors.
Thank you very much, Ms. Wintermeyer. We'll be looking forward to see the complementary standards convention on 29 2014, and also the recommendations that might come for Qatars. And next, we will go to our speaker, Dr. Sam Scott, from Forced Labour Monitoring Group. Dr. Scott's research interests focus on labour migration and workplace exploitation. He has worked in universities such as Sheffield, Liverpool, Bristol, and Exeter. Dr. Sam is the principal investigator on the ESRC-funded Forced Labour Monitoring Group, which is a 12-month pilot project funded by the Economic and Social Research Council. It has been established because of the belief in the need for a permanent focal point for academic and policies discussions around forced labor. Dr. Sam, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, and thank you to the Global Network for inviting me, and also for initiating a much needed discussion, I think, at an international NGO level around the need to identify and tackle forced labour. What I want to do today is speak from the perspective of the UK. Now, the statistics demonstrate that forced labour in the UK is not a huge issue, but I want to A, argue that it is an issue in the UK, and B, that lessons can be learned from the research that's being carried out on forced labour in the UK perspective. Before I do, though, I want to draw attention to two groups of workers. The first group are the 23 Chinese migrant workers who died on the 5th of February 2004 on the sands of Morecambe Bay. Now, some of you will be familiar with the context behind that, but effectively that tragedy on Morecambe Bay led to the development of what was called the Gangmasters Licensing Authority. Now, the Gangmasters Licensing Authority is an agency in the UK that licenses labour providers in the food sector, so that's in food processing, in farming, and also shellfish gathering. Now, what happened there was, as a direct result of a tragedy and the death of 23 migrant workers supplied through gangmasters, there was direct state response to that tragedy. Second example I want to bring to your attention is the Nepalese workers in Qatar. And the Guardian have published figures that show that 70 Nepalese construction workers in Qatar died between 2012 and 2013. They're the latest figures that the Guardian have published. And I think the big question is how states respond to tragedies like that. We've seen in the UK that we can have positive policy responses in response to the deaths of migrant workers, and any workers for that matter. We're interested in all kinds of workers, not just migrant workers, but we've seen how there can be a positive response. The question for the Qatari government, I think, is how the response to the 70 deaths, and no doubt there will be future deaths as well, how the Qatari government can respond to that. Now, in relation to the UK case, what I want to draw attention to is two pieces of research funded by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, one on the experiences of forced labour in the UK food industry and one on the scope of forced labour in the UK. And that research effectively has led me to come up with 7 main lessons that I think are interesting in terms of looking at forced labour, not only in a UK context, but also in an international context. The first lesson to draw our attention to is that forced labour is not an isolated social problem or something only affecting immigrants. It's part of a wider issue of work-based harm. So people who are interested in forced labour aren't specifically, just from an academic perspective, aren't just interested in the cases of forced labour. We're also interested in this broader notion of work-based harm, and that would involve abuse, exploitation, mistreatment, not just the criminal offence of forced labour. So that's the first point. Let's look at the wider social problem rather than the specific criminal offence of forced labour, because we're interested in the whole spectrum of work-based harm that occurs. The second point that I want to make is that when dealing with forced labour in the UK in particular, it's been associated with a human trafficking perspective. And what I want to argue is that forced labour as an agenda is linked in some cases with human trafficking, but it should be decoupled from a human trafficking agenda. That it is an issue, it's a standalone issue in its own right. It's to my view, it's a more important issue than human trafficking. It's a bigger issue than human trafficking in terms of numbers, and that in the UK context in particular, we've looked at forced labour through the perspective of human trafficking, and we shouldn't. We should look at forced labour in its own right and connect it to the wider problem of work-based social harm. Third point I want to make out of the 7 points is that exposure to inequality is vital in underpinning worker vulnerability to forced labour. A concern with forced labour should also imply a concern for greater social justice. So this relationship between inequality and forced labour, unequal conditions, whether they're within a nation state or whether they're between nation states, are the key breeding ground, if you like, for forced labour. And that when we're tackling forced labour at an international and national perspective, we really need to think about levels of inequality and entrenched levels of inequality within particular nation states and between nation states, because it's where one finds large inequalities, and it's where one finds widening inequalities that one tends to find forced labour as significant. The fourth point that I want to make is that the state, in some ways, is Janus-faced in relation to forced labour. In one sense, states will pass laws to combat forced labour. In the UK, we've seen laws that have been passed to combat forced labour. But in another sense, states want to support particular interests of business and capital, and that they may involve deregulation of labour markets. So what you sometimes see is you see a two-faced approach. In one sense, states are saying that they're outlining and combating forced labour, and in another sense, we're seeing labour markets become increasingly deregularised and informal, and therefore conditions are being put in place that can actually lead to forced labour. Fifthly, one point that I think is important to note is that legislation is often passed to define and combat forced labour, and that legislation can have the unintended consequence of actually limiting the size of the problem. So in the UK state context, for example, forced labour has been defined as something that's affecting between 10 and 20 cases per annum, legal cases per annum. And we would argue that the actual problem of forced labour is much more significant than that. And therefore what we need to be careful about is that forced labour isn't used to actually limit and redefine the problem, to make the problem of work-based harm smaller. And that's why my first point was that we need to look at the issue of work-based harm rather than just forced labour in the UK context. There's also a significant pressure to quantify, my sixth point is there's a significant pressure to quantify forced labour. And that's all very well in the sense that the figures give a very definite view that forced labour is a problem of the non-Western world, it's a problem for the developing world and mid-level developed economies. And the statistics tend to imply that forced labour is not a significant problem in the developed world, in the EU, in the USA. But what we would argue is that this pressure to quantify the problem can divert attention away from countries like the UK and countries of the EU and countries of North America, when in fact there are problems of work-based harm and exploitation in those countries. And the seventh point I want to stress is that the indicators making up the offence of forced labour are still subject to debate. They're still subject to case law defining what the actual offence of forced labour is, and the debate's still out there. We have the ILO's 6 main indicators of forced labour, but at a national level, it's still up to states to actually determine how forced labour is defined, and there is still considerable debate over how forced labour should be defined, both in a court of law and in terms of policy and implementation. And to make that final point, what I want to just do is show you a few slides of quotations from people in our research project who we interviewed. We looked at the scale and scope of forced labour in the UK food industry, and we interviewed people to get their experiences of work in the food industry. This is from a UK context where statistics show that there are only a few thousand at most forced labour cases per annum. And what we found there were significant degrees of work-based harm, significant degrees of exploitation, abuse, mistreatment. But it was very debatable as to whether that could be classified formally as forced labour and whether the criminal offence of forced labour had been actually occurred. And I want to put up 7 instances of what we term work-based harm, and the first one is related to daily precarity. I won't read out the quotations, I'll let you read them out. The second one is related to the threat of dismissal. So, on a daily basis, people not only have precarity at work and are unsure as to where the next job or next form of employment is coming from, they're also regularly exposed to the threat of dismissal as being a disciplinary procedure against them. They're also subject to dehumanising treatment. This is in the UK, where forced labour is not seen as a major issue. These were in the food industry, by the way, so they were on farms, in food processing factories, and also in restaurants. It was across the food chain, a field to fork case study. We've got excessive surveillance, people watching over workers' shoulders all the time, keeping an eye on productivity, but not just keeping an eye on productivity, but really in a kind of excessive manner, an authoritarian manner, and really monitoring the workers and treating the workers in inhumane ways. We've got linked to that unrealistic targets, people being set targets that were clearly not achievable, and being expected to pick food and processed products at a particular rate in order to meet the national minimum wage requirements, and not being able to achieve that. There's a thing here mentioned called piecework, which is where people are paid by the volume of products they actually produce, rather than at the national minimum wage. We've got a lack of effectively private and social life, and people just being treated as workers and not having any respect for their need for a leisure time, need for private and family life. These are all quotations from migrant workers in the UK, none of whom had actually been recognised as formal forced labour victims. And it's just making the broad point that I started with, that I think if you're interested in forced labour, one of the things that you should be interested in to start with is the bigger problem of work-based harm, and then determining what forced labour is as part of that, and whether indeed it is forced labour or whether it's exploitation, abuse or mistreatment. Forced labour is the criminal offence, but there are lower level offences, employment level offences and civil offences that might come into play.
Thank you very much, Dr. Scott. And next we would like to present Dr. Alice Balch. He's a human rights expert and forced labour expert. He has worked on many series of projects on the contemporary and anti-slavery and forced labour and human rights. These, in 2012, Dr. Balch completed a report on enforcement and regulation to tackle forced labour. Dr. Balch, thank you very much for coming, please.
Thank you. I think I'll try and be brief, because I think we're on to number 6 now in the presentation. So thank you everyone for your patience, and thank you very much for inviting me to this event. It's great that there's now some awareness and there's some media attention on this issue, and it allows people such as those on this panel to talk about some of the work we've been doing to try and tackle the problem of forced labour. Of course, I've been asked to talk about my work in relation to what we found out in Qatar, and this obviously is highlighted because of the FIFA World Cup in 2022. I would add that I think we're going to see similar issues in Brazil, and we certainly saw issues around human trafficking in London in 2012. So one of the points I'm going to be making, one of the themes I think, is about the ability of European states and other parts of the world to make judgments about Qatar because of some of the problems closer to home. So my research is focused on immigration policies. I'm interested in the relationship between immigration and the state, why the state treats migrants so poorly and can be so cruel towards migrant workers, and how that policy making works. But that work is now expanded really to look at forced labour and human trafficking, particularly with the UK debate now describing these issues as modern day slavery, which is a term which Paul Murphy used here today. And it's a very popular term, but it's one that's difficult for academics to use because of the uncertainty over the definitions and the distinction between forced labour, slavery and trafficking. I won't go into too much detail, but that's something we can maybe discuss afterwards. For the rest of the presentation, I just want to briefly look at three, what I would say, interlinking political dilemmas which the Qatari situation highlights. The first of this is the guest worker phenomenon, and the guest worker phenomenon is central to this situation. How it has developed in the oil monarchies in the Middle East, but also the lessons from Europeans, the European guest worker experience, because we shouldn't forget that Europe still has guest worker-like programs. The second is the effect or the impact of international labour standards, and there's a debate here about whether those international labour standards are having an impact or not, and how they could better have an impact. And the third and final political question is about the influence of Europe, the ability of European politicians, the ability of international NGOs to influence Qatar and to put pressure on Qatar, and the right of those individuals, organisations and states to put pressure on Qatar. So, beginning with the guest worker system, we know, thanks to World Bank estimates, that around 15 million guest workers are in the Gulf Cooperation Council states. And these countries use very highly restrictive immigration systems. In fact, the chances of citizenship for those immigrant workers are virtually nil. And that's a distinction from the European system where, although initially not expected to become citizens, many workers who come to Europe do have the distant prospect of citizenship. And I think that's a crucial distinction. We know about the precarious nature of work in recent times because of the Guardian newspaper, but you only have to think back a couple of years to the exodus of migrant workers following the Arab Spring events in Libya and the expulsion of Yemeni workers after Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, to understand that the states in these countries have almost unparalleled power over these groups of workers to do with almost as they please. We have seen some interventions by sending states, and we heard about the Nepalese efforts to help the lot of the immigrant workers. And there have been other interventions, particularly around female migration, contract workers, domestic workers. But what we found is that the attempts of sending states to do to make a difference is mitigated by weak patterns of enforcement and the undermining practices of irregular or less than formal recruitment practices. So these recruitment practices, once the migration patterns are in place, quite easily circumvent state-based efforts to restrict migration flows. I don't want to spend too long going through the details. I wanted to really bring up the political question, which is how can we explain or even justify the restriction of rights for migrant workers? And this is something which political scientists have been grappling with for decades, if not longer. A lot of recent work has looked at the trade-offs between the skills of those coming and the rights that they enjoy. I'll point out one particular piece of work because it's very relevant in the UK context. That's Martin Bruce's work, The Price of Rights, who argues that we can understand immigration policies on the basis of supply and demand. If you have a very large supply of low-wage workers, then the state can get away with giving those people less rights. If they're more in-demand, high-skilled workers, then the state has to give them a higher level of rights and more opportunities for permanent residence. So in other words, and I think this echoes something said earlier, the state does what it can get away with. For other people, there are other trade-offs, and the trade-off I think we also heard earlier, which is the trade-off between the raising of labour standards on the one hand, and then the demands for greater flexibility in the labour force on the other. And this is something that I think is very relevant to Europe in times of austerity, where across Europe policies are being enacted to try and increase flexibility, but possibly at the expense of labour standards. I think my conclusion to both of those notions of trade-offs is that neither are acceptable, and we can't justify the restriction of rights for migrants. And so compromises that result in forced labour conditions are not acceptable. They can't be justified through rational supply-demand type explanations. I just wanted to talk briefly also about the ILO, and I think it was great that we had the presentation about how the ILO has really been at the forefront of what you call the international labour standards, or the creation of international labour standards for 100 years, near enough. And the ILO is certainly the organisation which has managed to create a fairly good set of indicators and measurements to allow us to think about forced labour. I think the question that most people who don't necessarily understand international relations would be asking is how, if we have all these agreements, we have the human rights agreements at the international and regional level, all of those outlaw slavery and forced labour, Article 4 in most in the European and the UN declaration. So if it's been outlawed for nearly 100 years, why does it continue? And I think we need to ask how robust and effective these international regimes really are. In particular, I want to ask the question of whether the shift since the 2000s to a more sort of soft law standards approach rather than binding legal agreements has perhaps allowed greater space for states to circumvent some of those labour standards. And the US is complicit in this because the US doesn't sign ILO agreements because it claims it already has the relevant labour standards. So it weakens the regime in two ways. It doesn't join it, and then it criticises states on the basis of those exact standards. So you have this problem of the most powerful states in the world potentially undermining a UN organisation's attempts to improve labour standards. So what we've seen at the national level, and I think Sam mentioned this, the UK example is a very clear one, that national levels of regulation and inspection have been reduced or removed. There's been a rollback of labour law and a deregulation of labour markets and attacks on union activity. And this has created a sort of fear or uncertainty in the workforce, particularly with the threat of industries disappearing or moving overseas, to the extent that workers don't feel, even local, workers that are aware of their rights are not even willing to fight for those rights because of the threat of job loss. So how could we expect migrant workers with a lower level of knowledge of their rights and potentially more precarious residence situation to fight for those rights as well? There has been attempts and reaction to try and sort of re-regulate at the international level. Of course, the ILO, I think, is at the forefront of that. But we need to ask what the states that we're part of or living in have done to help this. So that means the EU, it means countries like the UK, and we need to ask how they're strengthening that international regime. Are they implementing? Are they creating example? And that brings me to my final point. How can we influence countries like Qatar to improve the way they treat their workers, to try and stop deaths at work, to try and stop the abuse of migrant workers? This is a big topic in European studies. How does Europe influence the world? Is Europe a force for good? Is the EU a force for good? Often referred to as the normative power Europe debate, if any of you have come across that phrase. So we know there has been some political movement in the European Parliament. The vote in 2011 to block a textile agreement with Uzbekistan was very good. So we've seen some engagement with the European Parliament, but as Paul Murphy mentioned, the Parliament is not the legislator. It doesn't actually propose new legislation. It can block it and delay that legislation. But what we need is the Council and the Commission to take a stand. We're also increasingly aware of these issues because of the actions of people like NGOs and the ILO exposing, and also investigative journalists such as The Guardian, exposing issues around the world. And this is great because it gives the public awareness of some of the problems in our supply chains, the presence of slavery and the goods that we enjoy. Unfortunately, these revelations seldom lead to any meaningful actions by governments and don't really exert that much pressure. So, going back to this notion of Europe and what it can do, I think the most obvious recommendation for the EU is to become an example for the rest of the world, and that's where the power of Europe as a sort of as an influencer comes from. If the Europe of rights and values, which was proclaimed by the Lisbon Treaty, can actually become a reality, and workers in the EU can actually enjoy those rights and values, and that goes for also migrant workers in Europe. If that can be made a reality, then the EU could really then claim to have the right to judge other countries such as Qatar. I only have to think of the recent figures from the ILO that claimed that 880,000 workers in Europe are suffering forced labour conditions now. To understand that while there is no direct, equality with what's happening to the Nepalese workers in the Middle East, we do need to look closer to home at the guest worker-like systems which exist in Europe. And if we can do that, and we can solve some of those problems, that means I think that Europe can play a greater role in increasing labour standards worldwide.